Ethan Reynolds stood alone in his penthouse, staring out at the sprawling city of Los Angeles. The skyline shimmered in the distance, a beautiful mosaic of lights and life, but none of it touched him. His luxurious home, with its marble floors, towering windows, and tastefully chosen decor, felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The wealth he'd worked so hard for was hollow, the power and influence he commanded ultimately futile in the face of his growing loneliness. He ran a hand through his dark hair, sighing deeply as memories of past mistakes tugged at him. Betrayal. It was a word that had come to define his existence. Years ago, he'd trusted the wrong people, people who had ultimately betrayed him in the most devastating of ways. A broken heart and bruised ego had built the walls around him. Now he couldn't remember a time when he didn't feel disconnected from the world around him. The ticking of the clock echoed in the silence, its rhythmic sound underscoring the emptiness that had become his reality. He had everything anyone could want: money, fame, and respect. But in the quiet moments, those things felt meaningless. What was the point of it all if you had no one to share it with? His eyes drifted over the grand living room, the plush furniture unused, the sound system untouched. There were no friends, no family, no real connections. Only a series of transactions and deals that had left him feeling cold. It was on one restless, rainy night that Ethan decided to do something out of character. He needed an escape, anything to break the monotony of his sterile existence. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence in his chest as he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. The world outside was slick with rain, the streets glistening in the glow of streetlights as if the city itself was alive. Ethan got into his sleek black car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel, unsure of where he was headed. He didn't need to know. He just needed to be somewhere else, anywhere but here. The rain pattered against the car windows as he drove aimlessly, his thoughts racing. The city seemed endless, the streets a blur of headlights and the occasional passerby, oblivious to the billionaire in the car beside them. Ethan had no destination in mind. He was simply searching for something, an escape, a distraction, anything to quell the emptiness that had settled deep inside him. After driving for what felt like hours, Ethan found himself in an underground garage near the edge of the city. It was quiet here, the only sound the soft hum of the car's engine. He parked the car and stepped out into the dimly lit space, his shoes clicking against the cold concrete. The garage was nearly empty, save for a few vehicles parked at the far end. It was peaceful, a rare oasis of calm in a city that never slept. As he walked toward the exit, a flicker of movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a shadow or a stray animal. But then he saw her, huddled against the wall in a damp alley, a young woman wrapped in a thin, tattered coat. Her body was curled inward, as though she were trying to protect herself from the cold. Ethan's first instinct was to ignore her, to walk away, but something held him in place. A sense of unease prickled at the back of his mind. He wasn't the type of person to get involved in others' problems, especially not with someone like her. She was a stranger, nothing more than a face in a sea of faces. But as he took a step forward, he saw the shiver that racked her body. She looked so small, so fragile, alone in the cold night. For a moment, he hesitated. Was this some kind of trap? A scam? He had learned long ago that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but something about her vulnerability, the way her eyes darted nervously, stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years. Compelled by an unfamiliar urge, Ethan approached slowly, his voice low. "Are you okay?" he asked, his words tentative, unsure. The young woman looked up, startled by his presence. Her eyes, wide with fear, met his, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw a flicker of something raw and real that struck a chord deep within him. She didn't speak at first, but he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her shoulders trembled. Ethan took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "You're cold. You shouldn't be out here." Without thinking, he removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, feeling an unexpected sense of protectiveness. "I can take you somewhere safe," he offered. She looked at him warily, unsure whether to trust him. Ethan, usually a master of detachment, found himself feeling a strange sense of urgency. "I can help. I won't hurt you," he added, his voice softer this time. After a long pause, the woman nodded slightly, the tension in her body easing just a fraction. She didn't speak, but her silent consent was enough. Ethan gestured toward his car. Come with me. Just for a little while. You'll be safe. They made their way back to the car, the rain still falling steadily. Ethan's mind raced as he led her to the passenger side. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he felt compelled to help her. He didn't usually involve himself with strangers, especially ones like her. But tonight, something was different. He felt a strange connection to this woman, one that he couldn't quite explain. It was as if her pain resonated with his own, though he'd never admit it out loud. The drive back to his penthouse was quiet, the sound of the rain on the windshield the only noise between them. Ethan tried to steal glances at her, but she kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the window. Her silence was almost deafening, but it didn't seem uncomfortable. She seemed resigned, as if she had long ago accepted that people, like her, didn't matter in a world full of indifferent faces. Once inside the penthouse, Ethan led her to the guest room, offering her a towel and a robe. You can clean up. Take your time, he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the wall she had built around herself, but he didn't push. She was fragile, and pushing too hard might break something that wasn't ready to be broken. As she disappeared down the hallway, Ethan found himself standing alone in the large, empty living room once again. But this time, the silence didn't feel as oppressive. Ethan paced restlessly around the living room, the soft click of his shoes on the polished floor barely audible over the storm outside. He wasn't used to having company, especially not of this nature. His mind kept racing, turning over the events that had led him here. Why had he offered her a place in his home? It wasn't like him to show compassion for a stranger, let alone a woman like her. She had that look, the kind of look that suggested years of hardship, eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. The sound of a door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned just in time to see her step back into the living room. The robe she wore was oversized, swallowing her small frame, but there was something about her that softened the harshness of the room. Her hair, damp from the shower, hung loosely around her shoulders, and for the first time he noticed how young she really was. She couldn't have been more than 22, maybe 23. For a brief moment, they stood in silence, sizing each other up. Ethan felt a strange mix of guilt and curiosity flood over him. He hadn't planned to involve himself this deeply, but he couldn't deny that something about her presence stirred something within him. "Can I get you something to drink?" Ethan offered, his voice quieter than he intended. She nodded, but only slightly, still wary. Ethan moved toward the kitchen and prepared tea. Something simple, something that didn't feel too intrusive. He set 2 cups on the counter and paused, trying to figure out what to say. He had always been good at controlling conversations in business, where words were weapons and smiles were shields. But with her, everything felt different. She wasn't interested in the polished version of himself he presented to the world. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, that unsettled him. When he returned, she was sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. There was a stillness about her, as if she were holding herself together just enough to keep from falling apart. Ethan handed her the cup of tea, and they both sat down. The silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable. He couldn't help but notice the way her eyes flicked toward the windows, as though she were trying to escape from the world outside. "So what's your name?" Ethan asked, his tone casual but his curiosity piqued. She hesitated, as if weighing the decision to speak her truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Lena." The name hung in the air, and for a moment, Ethan simply looked at her. He didn't press for more details, sensing that this wasn't the time to dive into her life story. Instead, he took a slow sip of his own tea, trying to keep the conversation light. "I'm Ethan," he said, watching her. "Do you want to talk about what happened? Or what brought you here?" Lena shook her head, her expression distant. "Not yet. Maybe later." Her gaze dropped to her lap, and for a moment, Ethan saw a flicker of something. Vulnerability, perhaps, or fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan nodded, respecting her boundaries. He didn't push, though a part of him wanted to know more. What was she running from? Who had hurt her? But he knew that some things couldn't be forced, not when trust was still so fragile. The minutes passed slowly, the sound of the rain outside the only thing breaking the stillness. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something like peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from solitude, nor the comfort he found in material wealth. It was the kind of peace that came from simply being in the presence of another person, someone who, despite the silence, didn't make him feel alone. Lena eventually set her cup down, her fingers curling around the porcelain like she was trying to hold on to something. Ethan could see her discomfort, the way her posture was tense, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet opening, like a door just slightly ajar. "So," he began, his voice breaking the silence, "what brought you to the city?" Her eyes flicked up to meet his, but only for a brief second. She seemed hesitant, as though deciding whether or not she could trust him with the truth. For a long moment, Lena said nothing. Instead, she glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the opulence surrounding them. The polished surfaces, the expensive art on the walls, the rich colors of the furniture, it all seemed so foreign to her, out of place against the woman sitting in front of him. "I came here for a fresh start," Lena said finally, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But they didn't go as planned." Ethan didn't press for more. He could tell from the way her eyes clouded over that the story behind those words was much deeper than she was letting on. He didn't need her to tell him the details. He could sense the weight of her past pressing down on her, the scars that ran deeper than anything visible. He knew what it was like to wear a mask, to hide the pain behind carefully constructed walls. "Fresh start, huh?" Ethan mused, his voice thoughtful. "I can relate to that." Lena glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly as if she were surprised by his admission. Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling for a moment, as though the words had taken him by surprise too. "I used to believe that if you worked hard enough, if you built something from the ground up, you could leave the past behind," he continued, his voice softening. "But sometimes, no matter how far you run, the past catches up with you." Lena was quiet, her lips pursed as she seemed to contemplate his words. She didn't offer any response, but Ethan didn't need one. He wasn't seeking validation or sympathy. He was simply stating a truth, one that she might understand more than he realized. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different, more comfortable. They didn't need to fill the space with words. The tea had cooled, and the storm outside had eased into a gentle drizzle. The tension that had initially hung in the air was slowly dissipating, replaced by a quiet understanding. For reasons neither of them could articulate, they had found something in each other that had been missing for so long. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel quite so alone. The hours passed by slowly in the warmth of Ethan's penthouse, the storm outside now a gentle murmur against the windows. Lena had taken a quiet seat on the couch, her robe still loosely hanging around her. Her posture was relaxed now, but there was a lingering tension in her eyes. She hadn't spoken much since their conversation about fresh starts, and Ethan didn't push her to say more. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a calm before the storm, the calm before they both had to confront things they weren't quite ready to face. Ethan leaned back in his armchair, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. His mind was far from settled. The strange pull he felt toward Lena, this woman who had appeared out of nowhere, drenched in rain and seemingly lost in the world, was confusing him. He wasn't a man who opened up easily, and yet, here he was, sharing his past with someone he hardly knew. There was something about her presence, her quiet strength, that made him lower his guard, if only just for a moment. Lena had become more than just a stranger he'd taken pity on. She was a puzzle, one he wasn't sure he wanted to solve yet. Her life was a mystery wrapped in layers of silence, and despite the fact that she didn't talk much, her eyes spoke volumes. Her vulnerability had drawn him in, but it was more than that. She reminded him of the person he used to be, a man full of hope and dreams before everything had fallen apart. "You don't have to stay," Ethan said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. "If you don't feel comfortable here, I won't hold you." Lena shifted in her seat, her gaze focused on the steaming mug of tea in her hands. For a moment, he wondered if she was considering leaving. It would have been easier for both of them if she did. But instead, Lena surprised him by looking up with a quiet determination in her eyes. "I'll stay," she replied softly, though her voice betrayed the uncertainty she still felt. "For tonight." Ethan nodded, but the question lingered in the back of his mind. Why did she stay? What was it that kept her here when she could have walked away at any point? He could have pressed her for an answer, but something in the way she held herself, a subtle defiance in her gaze, told him that pushing would only make things harder. Instead, he let the silence settle again, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As the night stretched on, the air between them grew heavier with questions left unsaid. Ethan found himself thinking more and more about her life, her choices, and what had led her to this moment. It wasn't just about the storm outside, it was about the storm inside of her. What had driven her to this place of quiet resignation? What was her story? And what did it have to do with him? Lena finally broke the silence again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't always like this." Ethan's gaze flickered toward her, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the cup as if it were her only lifeline. "I had dreams once. I was going to open a bakery. I had everything planned. But life didn't work out the way I expected. Things fell apart. People let me down." Ethan listened intently, his heart tightening as he recognized the familiar pain in her words. It wasn't just the failure of a business, it was the loss of something much deeper, the loss of trust and hope. He could relate to that. He knew the sting of disappointment all too well, and the sharp ache of seeing everything crumble. "Do you still want to try again?" Ethan asked gently, his voice low but sincere. Lena met his gaze, her expression conflicted. "I don't know. I'm not sure I have the strength to start over." Ethan didn't respond immediately, his mind working through her words. There was something in her that reminded him of himself, someone who had been knocked down so many times that the idea of getting back up seemed like a distant, unreachable goal. But there was also a flicker of something else in her eyes, something that suggested a hidden resilience, a willingness to fight even when the odds were stacked against her. "I think you're stronger than you realize," Ethan said quietly, his voice almost a reassurance to both of them. Lena didn't answer, but the briefest of smiles tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Ethan feel like maybe, just maybe, things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. The morning light filtered softly through the windows, casting a warm glow over the penthouse. Ethan woke to the quiet sound of Lena moving around the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes breaking the stillness of the early hours. He blinked awake, his mind still foggy from sleep, and glanced over at the couch where Lena had slept the night before. She was already dressed, her robe replaced by a simple pair of jeans and a shirt that looked slightly worn but clean. She didn't seem out of place in his home anymore, even though only a few hours ago she had been a stranger, someone he had only met in the depths of a storm. The way she moved through the space now was more familiar, like she had belonged here all along. Ethan sat up slowly, his mind wandering as he processed the night before. He had expected it to be awkward, perhaps even uncomfortable, but it hadn't been. Instead, it had been different. It had been a rare moment of peace for him, a rare moment where he hadn't had to put on the mask he wore every day. Lena turned when she heard him stir, offering him a small, almost shy smile. "Good morning." "Morning," Ethan replied, his voice groggy from sleep. He rubbed his eyes and stretched, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than he intended. "You didn't have to make breakfast." Lena shrugged, her smile lingering. "I wanted to. It's the least I can do after everything you've done for me." The words hung between them for a moment. It was strange. This exchange of kindness felt foreign to Ethan, almost out of place. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of someone's gratitude, but something about Lena's sincerity made him feel seen, in a way he hadn't felt in years. They sat down together at the table, eating in quiet companionship. The air was light, but there was still an underlying tension that neither of them acknowledged directly. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Lena was holding something back, something important. But he didn't ask. Instead, they simply shared a meal, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. As the morning wore on, Ethan found himself thinking about what Lena had said the night before, about her dreams, her broken past, and the road that had led her here. She was more than just a stranger in need of shelter. She was someone who had experienced loss, who had been hurt, who had learned the hard way that life didn't always give second chances. But maybe, just maybe, she was finding one here, with him. The day drifted lazily by, a quiet stillness settling over Ethan's penthouse. Lena had grown more comfortable in her new surroundings, moving through the space with a sort of tentative ease, as though testing whether this new reality could really be hers, even if just for a brief moment. Ethan had found himself more observant than usual, noticing the smallest details, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way she sat, always slightly on edge, as though bracing for something. He'd learned a lot in the past few days. Lena had been through more than her fair share of hardships, but she was determined to move forward. Yet, there was always a hesitancy in her eyes, a shadow of the person she used to be. Ethan could see it, the weight of her past pulling at her every step. That afternoon, after she'd finished sorting through a few of her things, Lena wandered toward a small bookshelf in the corner of the living room. Ethan had always kept it stocked with a mix of fiction, history, and old journals from his own life. But today, his attention shifted to Lena as she picked up a small, worn-out photograph from one of the shelves. The picture was of a woman, probably in her late 40s, with a warm smile and a gentle gaze. The woman had her arm around Lena, who was much younger, her face a picture of innocence and hope. The two of them were standing in front of a modest but well-kept house, the kind that suggested a life built on love, not wealth. Ethan hadn't realized he'd been watching until Lena spoke, her voice soft and distant, almost lost in the memories. "This was my mom," she said, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the photograph. Ethan sat up, the weight of the moment sinking in. There was so much about Lena he didn't know, so much more to her than the woman who had appeared at his doorstep in the rain. "She looks like a kind woman," he remarked quietly, his voice betraying his curiosity. He wasn't sure why he'd asked, but once the words were out, he wanted to hear more. Lena smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. She was. She was the one who taught me everything. How to bake, how to be strong, how to keep going even when everything seems impossible. Her fingers tightened around the photo and her voice broke ever so slightly. But she got sick. Cancer. It all happened so fast. And after she passed, everything just fell apart. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze intense as he tried to understand the weight of what she was saying. "That's a lot to go through," he said softly. Lena let out a slow breath. "It didn't just take her. It took everything I had. My dreams, my future. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep going, but it was too much. My bakery, my apartment, everything just slipped away. And eventually I found myself here, on the streets, no better off than the people I used to help." The words hung in the air, thick with the heavy reality of Lena's past. Ethan didn't know what to say. He could feel the ache in her voice, the pain of losing a mother, and with her, the last semblance of a stable, loving world. But what struck him most was the defiance he had seen in her eyes, the strength to keep moving even when everything seemed lost. Ethan's heart ached for her, and yet he couldn't help but admire her resilience. She had fought to survive, even when the odds were against her. And now she was here, sitting in his penthouse, a woman who had survived what seemed like impossible losses. "You didn't have to go through that alone," Ethan said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I mean, you shouldn't have." Lena glanced up at him, her eyes full of something close to surprise, but there was no trace of bitterness in her gaze. Instead, she gave him a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes but was still full of gratitude. "I wasn't alone, really," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had my mom for a while." Ethan nodded slowly, unsure of what else to say. There was a heavy silence between them now, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with the shared knowledge that they had both experienced loss that had shaped them into who they were now. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into her past, but he held back. He could see that Lena wasn't ready to share everything yet. There were parts of her that were still buried, still too raw to expose to anyone, even him. Instead, he changed the subject, offering her a way out of the heaviness that had settled between them. "So, what was your bakery going to be like?" he asked, his tone light and curious. Lena's eyes lit up a little at the question, her posture shifting as she became more animated. "It was going to be a small cafe," she said, her voice steadier now. "I wanted to make it a place where people could come, sit down, and feel like they were home. No rush, no pressure, just good food, good coffee, and good company." Ethan smiled, appreciating the spark in her eyes as she spoke about her dream. It was obvious that even now it was still alive within her, just waiting to be rekindled. Maybe, he thought, he could help her find a way to bring it back to life.
The days that followed were a strange mixture of progress and retreat. Ethan found himself growing more attached to Lena, despite his best efforts to remain distant. It was not love, not yet, at least, but there was something undeniable between them, something that tugged at the edges of his hardened heart. Lena, for her part, was slowly beginning to open up, though her walls were still high, her past too painful to be fully shared. Despite the growing bond between them, Ethan remained cautious. He had learned the hard way to keep his distance from people, to never fully trust anyone. But with Lena, it was different. There was a quiet honesty in her presence, something he hadn't expected to find, let alone allow himself to feel. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the conversation shifted from trivial matters to something much more personal. Lena had been quiet for a while, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the rim of her coffee cup. Ethan had been watching her, knowing that she was working through something in her mind. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice low, almost tentative. "About getting back to my dream, the bakery." Ethan leaned forward, his attention fixed on her. "You know I meant it. You've got the drive, Lena. I can see it. Whatever happened in the past, you can rebuild." Lena hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "I don't know if I can. It's hard to imagine getting back into something like that after everything." Ethan reached out, placing his hand on top of hers, an unspoken offer of reassurance. "Sometimes you have to take a step forward, even when it feels impossible. I've seen you fight. I believe in you." The words seemed to break something inside Lena. She didn't pull away. Instead, she met his gaze, her eyes softening. There was a vulnerability there, one that she had kept hidden for so long. "I've been scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared that if I try again, I'll fail. Scared that I'll lose everything." Again. Ethan's heart softened. He could understand that fear all too well. But as he looked at Lena, he saw something more than fear. He saw courage, wrapped up in layers of self-doubt. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could succeed. The days that followed carried with them a strange mix of progress and tension. Lena seemed to be gaining strength with each passing day, her reserved demeanor softening as she grew more comfortable in Ethan's penthouse. Yet, there were moments when the weight of her past would resurface. Small, fleeting instances where the cracks in her resolve would show, and Ethan could see the raw vulnerability hiding just beneath her tough exterior. Ethan, for his part, couldn't help but grow closer to Lena. It wasn't love yet, but there was something undeniable, something magnetic between them. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir inside him, a spark of hope he had long since buried. However, as their bond deepened, Ethan's mind began to wander to darker places. He couldn't forget his own history, the years spent building a fortress around his heart, all in an attempt to protect himself from the pain that had once consumed him. And, in a twisted way, he couldn't help but wonder if Lena was too good to be true. His thoughts were interrupted one afternoon when his phone buzzed on the coffee table, displaying the name of Michael Green, his former business partner. The relationship between them had soured years ago, and Ethan wasn't particularly eager to hear from Michael. Yet, something in his gut told him to answer. "What do you want, Michael?" Ethan asked, his voice a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "Ethan, listen, I don't have time to beat around the bush." Michael's voice crackled through the line. "I've been hearing things, rumors, and I'm telling you, be careful. There are people out there who will take advantage of you, no matter how kind you are. Trust me on this one." Ethan felt a chill run through him. Michael had always been a cynic, a man who saw the world through the lens of self-interest. Still, there was a part of Ethan that couldn't completely ignore the warning in his voice. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ethan asked, frustration lacing his words. Who's trying to take advantage of me? Don't be so naive, Michael snapped. You're telling me you don't see it? You've let some woman into your home, a stranger, one who doesn't even seem to have a past. You don't think there's more to her than what she's showing you? The accusation stung. Ethan felt the familiar walls of doubt rising, even though he had tried so hard to push them down. Michael's words echoed in his mind, and suddenly he wasn't so sure of his own instincts anymore. You don't know her, Ethan said, his voice lower now, more measured. She's just trying to get back on her feet. I'm helping her out. Helping her out, huh? Michael scoffed. Don't make the same mistake I did, Ethan. People like her don't change. She'll take everything from you, and when you've got nothing left to give, she'll be gone. Trust me. I've seen it happen before. The conversation ended abruptly, with Michael's warning hanging heavily in the air. Ethan sat in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He hadn't considered the possibility that Lena might have ulterior motives. It was the first crack in the foundation he had built, the first doubt that made him question everything. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself distancing himself from Lena, his mind clouded with suspicion. Every word she spoke, every look she gave him, was now weighed against the doubts Michael had planted in his mind. And yet, despite everything, he couldn't shake the sense that Lena wasn't like the people Michael had warned him about. She wasn't someone who would take advantage of him. But his heart ached with the fear that he had made a mistake by trusting her, by letting her into his life, and by hoping that there could be something real between them. The storm that had begun to brew in Ethan's mind finally came to a head one evening when he overheard part of a conversation between Lena and someone on the phone. He had been standing in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when he heard Lena's voice, low and urgent, coming from the living room. I need to get the money, she was saying, her words filled with a sense of desperation. It's the only way I can fix everything. If I can just get my hands on it, I'll be able to. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and the words suddenly felt like a punch to the gut. He didn't hear the rest of the conversation, but the implication was enough. Lena had been talking about money, large sums of it. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flooding him at once. Had she been using him all along? Was she after his wealth, trying to manipulate him into giving her something she didn't deserve? His hands clenched into fists as anger surged through him, and he could feel the familiar bitterness rising once more, the bitterness that had protected him from being hurt before. Without thinking, he walked into the living room, his voice sharp and cold. What's this about money, Lena? Lena froze, her expression instantly shifting from one of surprise to something much more guarded. She quickly set down the phone, trying to hide the tension in her posture, but Ethan could see the way her eyes flickered to the door. Heck, as if considering making a run for it. Ethan, it's not what you think, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't mean for you to overhear that. Then what did you mean? Ethan's voice was colder than he intended. What's going on, Lena? Who are you talking to? What's this about money? Lena swallowed hard, her face pale as she met his gaze. I wasn't using you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I wasn't trying to manipulate you. I swear. It's complicated. Ethan stepped closer, his emotions boiling over. How complicated could it be? You come into my life, looking for help, and now I find out you're hiding something about money? Lena's eyes filled with tears, and she took a shaky breath before speaking. It's from my mother's estate, she confessed. There was a delayed settlement after she passed. I've been waiting for months to get access to it, but the legal process is slow, and I haven't been able to fix anything until I get the money. It's not what you think. The words hit Ethan like a freight train. The anger that had been bubbling inside him suddenly dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming wave of guilt. His suspicions had clouded his judgment, and now, standing in front of him, was the woman he had allowed himself to trust, who had never once betrayed that trust. Ethan's heart sank. I'm sorry, Lena, he murmured, regret flooding through him. I thought you were lying. I thought you were taking advantage of me. Lena looked down, the tears now freely falling from her eyes. I never wanted you to think that. I never wanted to hurt you. Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. I should have believed you, he said softly. I'm sorry for doubting you. I was wrong. The days following the confrontation were the hardest Ethan had ever faced. He couldn't shake the image of Lena standing there, her face streaked with tears, her heart laid bare for him to see. The regret gnawed at him, a constant presence in his mind. He had let his fears, his insecurities control his actions, and in doing so, he had hurt the one person who had shown him kindness when he least expected it. Lena had left his penthouse that night, her steps heavy with the weight of his accusations. Ethan had tried to call her, to explain himself, but each time his calls went unanswered. The silence between them grew louder until it felt deafening. He spent the following days in a fog of self-loathing, each hour feeling like an eternity. His once pristine penthouse, filled with luxury and wealth, now seemed empty, haunted by the ghost of his own actions. The cold, distant walls that he had built around himself for years had come crashing down, and he was left with nothing but the raw ache of his own mistakes. Ethan knew he had to make things right. He had to find Lena, to apologize properly, to show her that he was willing to change, to undo the damage he had caused. But how? Where could he even begin? The answer came to him one night when he found himself staring out of the penthouse window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He remembered the shelter where Lena had spent some of her time helping others, offering her support to those in need. It was the one place he knew he might find her again. With a newfound sense of purpose, Ethan set out the next morning. He made his way through the city, his heart pounding in his chest, hoping beyond hope that Lena would be there. When he arrived at the shelter, he hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect. But then he saw her. Lena was sitting at a table with a group of women, her arms moving animatedly as she explained job applications with patience and kindness. Ethan watched her for a moment, his heart aching with regret, but also with admiration. She was everything he had never realized he needed. Taking a deep breath, Ethan approached the group. The women looked up at him with curiosity, but Lena's eyes, those soft, intelligent eyes, met his with wariness. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "Lena, I need to talk to you. Please." The group fell silent, and Lena's gaze shifted from cautious to confused. She slowly stood up, taking a step toward him, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" she asked, her voice calm but strained. "I've been a fool," Ethan said, his voice full of remorse. "I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you. I let my doubts get the best of me, and I made you feel like you weren't worth my trust when you've done nothing but show me kindness and honesty." Lena's expression softened slightly, but she didn't respond immediately. Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. Was she ready to forgive him? Did she even want to? "I know I can't undo what I did," he continued, his voice breaking, "but I want to try to make it right. I was wrong, Lena. You've been nothing but good to me. I should have believed you from the start." Lena remained silent for a long moment, her eyes studying him carefully. Ethan felt the weight of her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if she would forgive him, but he had to try. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "It's not easy to forgive someone who's hurt you," she said softly. "But I can see that you regret it, and that means something." Ethan felt a surge of relief wash over him, though he knew it wasn't enough to erase the pain he had caused her. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm not that person, that I'm someone who can be trusted." Lena nodded, her eyes flickering with something soft, something like hope. "I don't know if I can just forget what happened," she admitted, "but I'm willing to give you a chance. I can't promise it'll be easy, but we can try." Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with gratitude. "I won't let you down again." Over the following weeks, Ethan and Lena worked to rebuild the fragile trust between them. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the past would creep in, threatening to pull them apart again, but they slowly learned how to navigate their complicated emotions and heal together. Ethan had come to realize that, for all his wealth, his power, and his influence, it was the simple act of being vulnerable, of trusting another person, that had always eluded him. But Lena had shown him the value of kindness, of compassion, and of second chances. She had taught him that there was more to life than just the surface-level things he had spent so many years obsessing over. For Lena, too, there was a healing process. The wounds of her past were deep, and she couldn't erase them overnight. But as she spent more time with Ethan, she saw a side of him that she had never expected, one that was genuine, one that wanted to be better. She began to open up to him, slowly but surely, allowing him to see the parts of her that had been hidden for so long. One evening, as they sat together in Ethan's penthouse, Lena smiled softly as she gazed out at the city skyline. "You know," she said quietly, "I never imagined I'd be here. I never imagined I'd find someone who would care about me, let alone help me like this." Ethan turned to her, his gaze warm. "You don't have to imagine it anymore, Lena. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in years, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. He had learned to let go of his fears, his doubts, and his insecurities. He had found someone who understood him, someone who could see the person he truly was beyond the walls he had built. And in Lena, he had found not just redemption, but a chance at something real. As they sat together, the weight of the past lifted off their shoulders, replaced by the promise of a future built on trust, understanding, and love. They had both come a long way from where they had started, and they knew that, no matter what came next, they were ready to face it together. In the end, Ethan and Lena discovered that true healing doesn't come from perfection, but from embracing vulnerability and learning to trust again. Their journey, marked by moments of doubt and regret, ultimately led them to a place where love could thrive, free from the shadows of the past. Through their struggles, they found strength in each other, creating a bond that was unbreakable, a love built not on idealism, but on understanding, patience, and shared growth. Their story was a testament to the power of second chances and the beauty of discovering that, even after all the heartache, there is always room for redemption and new beginnings. Together, they learned that sometimes the greatest wealth is not in what you can possess, but in the connections you choose to nurture and the hearts you choose to trust. As they stepped into the future hand in hand, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they were ready to face them. Together, thank you so much for staying with us through this entire story. We truly appreciate you taking the time to listen and watch. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with others who might love it too. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you more exciting stories in the future. Stay tuned for more, and we hope to see you again soon.